quick apology in advance. We had some audio issues this week and some troubles with echoes and where our mics were placed here as we're sitting together. So our apologies for audio issues that you may experience during this episode. Hello and welcome to the Slate Political Gabfest. December 5th, 2024, the Is the Democratic Party Doomed edition. I'm David Plotz of CityCast. I'm in New York City with none other than Emily Bazelon. We're sharing a mic, Emily Bazelon of the New York Times Magazine and Yale University Law School.
Will we survive sharing the mic?
It's very, it's like one of those, it's like June and Johnny Cash. We gotta sing something here.
Ooh,
oh yeah,
that sounds like a great idea.
Or Bob Dylan and Joan Baez.
And then across the table from us here in Dickerson headquarters is John Dickerson of CBS News. Hello, John.
Hello. Excuse me, I was taking a swallow of the morning coffee.
We had our Conundrum show last night here in New York, and now we're gathered to talk about Hunter Biden's pardon and whether Democrats will pay a price for it, along with the apparent self-immolation of yet another lousy Trump nominee, Pete Hegseth. He's not yet self-immolated, but he's well on his way in an alcohol-fueled fire. Then, is the Democratic Party dead? Has Trump killed it? How can it recover? We will discuss the really interesting debate the party is having about its identity. Then the Supreme Court considers Tennessee's ban on gender-affirming care for trans kids. Plus, we'll have cocktail chatter. After promising that he wouldn't pardon his son, Hunter, President Biden issued a blanket pardon this week covering anything federal prosecutors could possibly investigate back to 2014. Tax evasion charges, drug charges, perjury, general corruption, you name it, Hunter Biden is off the hook for it. In pardoning Hunter Biden, Joe Biden argued that his son had been singled out for prosecution because of who he was and strung up on far-fetched charges that never would have been leveled at anyone else. I'm going to start, Emily, by ignoring the sort of preposterous and sanctimonious outrage of Trump allies who delighted certainly in his pardons of Charles Kushner and Paul Manafort and Steve Bannon, Michael Flynn and the like. It's honestly not worth taking that seriously. But some Democrats are outraged by Hunter Biden's pardon. And should they be?
Well, look, I mean, President Biden acted as a father here. And, you know, this is his surviving son who's had all of these travails, who is sober. And Biden feels like he was prosecuted for political reasons. And he's sparing his son, you know, a punishment of maybe a year or two in jail. And then I think importantly, this kind of threat that was looming over him that there could be future Trump prosecutions, right? So I don't think it was a coincidence that right after Trump announced that his choice for heading the FBI is Kash Patel, a person whose really sole qualification is that he's very excited to go do Trump's bidding on all things, including prosecutions, that this announcement came right after that. And so, you know, the excuse or rationale for it is this kind of fatherly concern. However, I think the Democrats who are outraged for two reasons. One was that Biden said that he saw this as a political persecution/prosecution by his own Justice Department, which really muddies the waters of the messaging about, you know, the norms of the Justice Department and abiding by the rule of law that Democrats have been trying to really put forth in a strong way that provides a contrast to Republicans. So now that gets blurry. And then I think the second thing, and you guys may think this is kind of weird, but it's one thing to pardon Biden prospectively for the threat that, you know, a Kash Patel FBI, a Trump Justice Department can pose. It's another thing to say this person who was convicted in federal court after getting his day in court shouldn't go and do, you know, a year or two of jail time or maybe just probation, which was basically the punishment on the table. That's the part I really struggle with. There's no evidence that the motivation for this prosecution was solely political. At the same time, it was a selective prosecution in the sense that it's really hard to imagine these charges about lying on a gun application because you were doing drugs having been brought as the sole charges in another case. So anyway, that's the kind of back and forth here. But I think to say that your own kid can't serve a serious but not like terrible for all time punishment, people are going to see that as self-dealing, and that is a problem.
There's a jury involved too, right?
Hunter Biden went before a jury and was convicted in the gun case in Delaware. In the California tax case, there was no jury because he pled guilty at the last minute.
So the wisdom of the jury system, I mean, obviously you have prosecutor's discretion, and maybe, as you say, this was shouldn't have been brought, maybe, or whatever. You can debate that piece of it. But once it's in court, isn't the theory of the jury system that regular folk in the jury box are not idiots, and they are the part of the wisdom of the system? And by that, Biden was guilty.
Right.
Well, Emily, I think I didn't catch something there. I didn't quite understand it. So when you said, what would be the way that Biden could have pardoned him, but pardoned him for other things that might be brought, but let stand this conviction? Was that doable?
He gave this incredibly broad pardon where he both pardoned the offenses of the conviction and then pardoned anything Biden might be investigated for, Hunter Biden, from 2014 on. And so it was including both elements that I'm talking about. There's been a lot of criticism about how sweeping the 2014 on pardon was. But if what you're worried about is a politically motivated investigation, and, look, let's also acknowledge this is coming after years of federal investigation and congressional investigation led by Republicans. But I completely can understand why Hunter Biden and his family would be concerned about further investigations, despite how little they have found to actually prosecute so far. So that was the distinction I was making.
John, I can't remember whether it's you or Emily who made this really smart point.
Emily.
Yes, definitely Emily. But there's this way in which Trump, one of the really terrible things about Trump is that he causes his enemies to abase themselves and to sacrifice their own principles to protect people from greater harms that he might do. And so this is an example where, if Kamala Harris was going to be president, if Nikki Haley was going to be president, there's no way. I think it's very unlikely that Biden would have done a pardon like this. But because of this anticipation of what Trump could do, Biden does this thing which is excessive, which is somewhat unprecedented, which is a little bit ugly. And It's bad. It's bad for everyone, but it's bad mostly because he's made Biden himself act against his own principles.
And maybe, though, this is exactly the kind of torquing and twisting and contorting of the system that is Trump's worst effect on America, right? It's the things he does, but then the things he kind of pushes people to do. And especially when you're doing something prospectively. I mean, there's now in political reporting that the Biden administration is considering prospective, preemptive pardons of other people who might get prosecuted, like Liz Cheney and Adam Schiff. And, you could add to the Tony Fauci, there's a list of people. And it's not that I don't understand the concern. It's that it is going to create this sense that, the rule of law is even shakier than we fear it's about to become.
And there's also a way in which the arguments being made in Biden's defense, with the exception of the father-son one, tend to mirror the arguments that Trump and his allies have made in defending him. So, for example, on the jury question, somebody might say, well, sure, the jury, convicted him. But I mean, when you have the full tonnage of the law going after someone and they put it before a jury, basically it's stacked against the defendant, which is basically essentially the argument that they make in support of Trump or any of his supporters. But I think it's worth stepping back just for a minute. And I know why you did what you did, David, in terms of the comparison to Trump. And what's so sticky and interesting about this case is the argument of the Biden team broadly and with respect to pardons is that there are inviolate standards. And regardless of the specifics of the case, you don't mess with those standards and norms. And that was such a clear line and drawn clearly because the attempt was to show how bad Trump was. This, of course, as you say, muddies that. But we got to remember what the people Trump pardoned. These were not his, blood relations. These were people, and you went through the list, David. But I mean, Michael Flynn, Roger Stone, Paul Manafort, Steve Bannon, all people who got in trouble carrying out Trump's political designs. And that's a far different thing. Pardons are on a continuum. They're always kind of icky. Bill Clinton pardoned Mark Rich, who was a fugitive from justice, whose wife gave a lot of money to his campaign and to Hillary Clinton's. And there was a lot of coverage at the time about the ickiness of that. Pardons get into icky territory, but there's a continuum. There's icky, and then there's something far down the line. And I think that an important thing, since we're on the topic of pardons, to think about with Trump is it's not just the kinds of people he pardoned, but also that it's a get out of jail free card for future activity on Trump's behalf over the next 4 years that I think is worth keeping in mind in this.
We also should add Charles Kushner to that list, right? I mean, he's Jared Trump's son-in-law's dad. He's also now the ambassador to France. So I think there's also been pushback from Democrats saying, like, come on, media, come on, Gabfest. Like, you're talking all about the single sin of, President Biden when all these other chaotic, scandalous, nepotistic things are going on.
I wonder what you guys think about. So the pardon, and even a preemptive pardon of Liz Cheney or Adam Schiff or Tony Fauci, what crime Tony Fauci could have committed is unthinkable, but whatever, is interesting. But the ability of the federal government to harass you, even without bringing a criminal case against you, is profound. So I think if I were in Hunter Biden's shoes, what I would be worried about is I'm going to spend the next 10 years of my life in one long IRS audit. Like, it's going to be an endless audit. And I kind of feel like that's what their ability, if they do want to make life miserable for people, is not just to criminally prosecute you. And also, there's lots of things that you can do with the FBI short of criminally prosecuting you, right? Where you can investigate somebody and never prosecute them.
Right. I mean, the IRS, yes, is a weapon. Nixon used it. It's a matter of civil liability, usually, though it can become criminal. And yes, an FBI investigation is its own huge headache in terms of anxiety and stress and legal fees. It is, I don't mean to minimize that at all, because it is a serious issue and we may be talking a lot about it over the next 4 years. Right. One wonders, though, instead of this kind of sweeping preemptive pardon move, if the Biden administration could be thinking of like helping find pro bono lawyers, helping raise money for legal fees as some kind of behind the scenes. It just seems like, I don't know. I'm just worried about this preemptive pardon step. Yeah. Can I also say one more thing? Like, pardons are really important for granting mercy to ordinary people who've gotten caught up in the criminal justice system for terrible reasons. And Rachel Barkow and Mark Osler, who are experts on pardons and law professors, have this long list of people who should be getting pardons.
Right,
like,
or not Hunter Biden.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like, Biden could commute all the federal death sentences into life sentences. He could extend his marijuana pardon to people who are convicted of distribution offenses, give permanent relief to the people who already got out under emergency provisions during COVID and are doing fine. Elderly people who can't get compassionate release. There's a list of much more deserving people. And to date, Biden has been extremely stingy about pardons, more than any other recent president.
I want to change the subject and go to another middle-aged man with substance abuse problems who is struggling this week, Pete Hegseth, who
very well turned.
Whose nomination for defense secretary, as we tape on Thursday morning, is alive, but on life support. We hear that it's reported that Trump has reached out to Ron DeSantis to step in Hegseth's place. There have been story after story about his alcohol problem, about his sexual misbehavior, about his anti-Muslim behavior, about his financial mismanagement. So, John, first of all, I mean, I don't want to put you in the position of making a prediction, but it seems unlikely that he's going to survive this. And is the problem that he didn't? Why is he not going to survive this? Because it's certainly lots of people. Is he just grotesquely incompetent, or is he grotesquely incompetent and covered up misbehavior to the Trump folks?
What we're talking about here is still in the same basket as the Hunter Biden, because what is the standard? And when do you keep the standard for whatever you're doing, and when do you break it, and why do you do so? Clearly Joe Biden fell short of the standard that he set repeatedly in public. Now, people can explain why that's okay, and that's up to the partisans to do so. But there's no question that he fell short of a standard. Obviously, falling short of the standard is, there are relative degrees of that. You can fall short a little bit, you can fall short a lot. And then there are two different kinds of standards. There's the sort of norms standard, this is the way we behave. And then there's the objective, this is what the job is. There's no question, like Hunter Biden wasn't a part of a job, but in the Hegseth case, there's a job he's supposed to do. And when I was calling around to former top Pentagon officials this week, the thing that had them gobsmacked was not so much the stuff about the misbehavior with women and the allegations of drunkenness as seriously as they took those things. They just said he has no experience relevant to what the job is, which is incredibly complex as a management job, even though he'll have lots of help. It's helping the president know when to use lethal force in a super complicated world. And you have to figure out how to retool the defense, as a defense secretary always does, for the future instead of the present. So that means artificial intelligence, supercomputing, war in space. Plus, you have a president who's saying, okay, there's all that stuff you got to do. Now I want you to use the military to help perhaps round up migrants. I want you to rewire some of our alliances that were fundamental to the way we've been doing things for a huge portion of the year. And I want you to fire huge swaths of the Pentagon. It's an incredibly complex job that somebody who doesn't have any visible qualifications to do it, and in fact, some of the reporting this week came out about his inability to manage these veterans organizations. So it's just like, for the basic standards of the job, he's unqualified. Now, it seemed like what's hurting him particularly this week is the drunkenness allegations, which have come from former allies at Fox, and in addition to the allegations from women.
The idea that we're going to have a lush, according to a lot of reporting by Jane Merritt, The New Yorker, by NBC, about Hegseth's Fox colleagues talking about like a month ago, that just seems crazy to me. Like, even in the standards of bananas land that we may wind up in this administration, like an actual person who goes to work at Fox with alcohol on their breath is going to be the Secretary of Defense. Like, wow.
It's interesting, actually. So if you, all these things are, of course, related if you assume that what we've heard is true. I mean, the mistreatment of women, the kind of the yelling anti-Muslim slurs in a bar while drunk is probably connected to being drunk. But so there's sort of personal behavior being drunk. There's the fact that he seems to be a serial have sexual misbehavior on tap, and he's financially mismanaged things. And he has no relevant experience. So, which one of these is the one that should take him down? I mean, obviously they should all take him down. I mean, it's all. But if he only had one of them, which would take him down?
I think the drunkenness in the end, to me, that just seems like everybody is going to understand that it could make you compromised. It could mean that at a key moment, your judgment is impaired.
And it also, implicit, I think, in what you're saying is the lowering of expectations about personal behavior towards women that's happened as a result of Donald Trump's being reelected and being fully supported by 99% of his party, despite the fact that he has publicly and privately, we all know the history of Trump and women, but that doesn't mean what it used to for the party that he's in.
Exactly. Crossing another bridge.
Do you guys think that anyone else is going to go down of these early nominees? Does it seem? I feel like the Senate is going to want to take at least one of them down. I don't know why. I feel
they
that
can
way.
already claim Gates.
I don't think the Senate is going to want to take anyone down. If they can avoid taking an actual vote against a Trump nominee, they will do that. But I'm not sure still. I mean, I think Hegseth is going to withdraw. I never should make predictions since I'm so often wrong, but I mean, come on. I think, though, that there are other nominees with serious vulnerabilities. Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., and Kash Patel are all going to be big swallows for the Senate, even with a Republican majority.
You know, it would be nice for some of these things to go to a vote, though, because, and what we're watching is in a funny kind of way, is like the reassertion of some kind of standard, because a lot of the standards with respect to Trump were, put aside, both personal behavior, truth-telling. You saw the leaders of the Republican Party claim he broke his oath. All those standards were put aside. But there are some creeping standards with respect to Gates and maybe even Hegseth. But it'd be nice to have a public airing so that people could stand behind David's question. Why exactly is he unfit? Let's be specific, if for no other reason than to educate the public about, what it means to be fit or not fit for these jobs. When they kind of are disappeared from the conversation, it actually kind of it leaves everything in a position where you can make up the rules as you go along.
This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by ZBiotics. After a night with drinks, it is tough to bounce back the next day. But with ZBiotics, there's a surefire way to wake up feeling fresh after a night of drinking. ZBiotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Pre-alcohol produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night, drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. Also, ZBiotics is continuing to invent probiotics that will help with everyday challenges of modern living. So go to zbiotics.com/Gabfest to learn more and get 15% off your first order when you use Gabfest at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with a 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/Gabfest and use the code GABFEST at checkout for 15% off. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Aura. Isn't it funny how the people we love most are often the hardest to shop for? Luckily, there is one gift that everyone on your list is sure to enjoy, an Aura digital picture frame. I know this from experience. I have bought Aura frames for relatives and for friends, very good for mothers and aunts, I would say. The pictures that we look at on my Aura frame or my mother's Aura frame bring so much delight and so much joy to our family. I was hanging out with some friends the other day, and we were talking about what to get as gifts. And two of my friends volunteered that they had gotten Aura frames for family members and how well those had gone over. The Aura frame was named #1 by Wirecutter, and every frame comes wrapped in a premium gift box. So there's no price tag on it, and you don't really need to do any wrapping, which for me is heavenly. So save on the perfect gift by visiting auraframes.com to get $35 off Aura's best-selling Carver matte frames by using promo code GABFEST at checkout. That's AURA frames.com, promo code GABFEST. This deal is exclusive to listeners, so get yours now in time for the holidays. Terms and conditions apply. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Home Chef. As chilly evenings set in and holiday decor lights up our homes, Home Chef is delivering new hearty recipes and comfort foods that pair perfectly with a cozy setting. I recently had a delicious pork taco with an incredible slaw that was an amazing home-cooked meal. My girlfriend and I shared it. It was delicious. It was spicy, but not too spicy. It was warming. It was a perfect fall meal. Home Chef delivers fresh ingredients and chef-designed recipes to your doorstep. And users of leading meal kits have rated Home Chef #1 in quality, convenience, value, taste, and recipe ease. And that recipe ease thing, for sure, their recipes are so well designed. For a limited time, Home Chef is offering listeners 18 free meals plus free dessert for life. And of course, free shipping on your first box. Go to homechef.com/Gabfest. That's homechef.com/Gabfest for 18 free meals and free dessert for life. Homechef.com/Gabfest. Must be an active subscriber to receive free dessert. Democrats are choosing a new DNC chair, and that has contributed to a fascinating period of introspection for the party at every level. Democratic leaders and pundits and advisors are asking themselves why the party lost to Trump, and more importantly, why it is shedding voters that used to be aligned with it. There are so many theories of the case, so many different ways of looking at it. Bernie Sanders is saying the party abandoned the working class. There's the theory that it's a global crisis, that all incumbent parties were punished, and that it doesn't mean that much that the Harris campaign and Democrats were punished. That seems to be the Harris campaign's main claim. There are people sort of hinting that it's too much wokeness and performative progressiveness, which seems to be the undercurrent of Rahm Emanuel's move. There's the argument that Ezra Klein is making that the party has locked itself to institutions and kept faith with institutions at a time where institutions are broadly failing lots of people, and Democrats haven't worked to fix them. There's the Jonathan Rauch theory that Trump and the 2008 crisis, financial crisis, and COVID and inflation, and a nihilistic right-wing media shattered the belief among a lot of people that politics can work at all. And so anti-politics or autocracy is a solution to that. So, John, which of these theories interests you and which doesn't?
Well, one of the things that interests me is that the last point you made, which is people who are kind of voting for autocracy. That's putting it a little bit bluntly and a little bit patly, but that's okay. We'll do it for the time being. And I guess two things come to mind with that is Ron Brownstein wrote a look back at the race, and he said he looked at some vote exit poll data that showed basically you had a majority of voters that agreed that Trump was too extreme and would steer the U.S. towards authoritarianism, but a decisive slice of those voters who held those negative views about Trump voted for him anyway. So strong was their desire for change with respect to whatever, mostly change with the economy. So to some extent, there's some portion of the electorate that is going into autocracy with their eyes open in a way, because they were so unhappy about the past. Assuming that's true, what does that mean? Does that last for more than 10 seconds? Because people, they want an alternative, but then once the alternative comes into office and starts doing things that they don't like, then they change their mind again, which has kind of been, we've seen a fair amount of whipsawing in American politics for a while. Or is it the findings of Nate Cohn at the New York Times that are, and both of these things can be true, by the way, which showed over the last 3 elections, Democrats have lost lots of voters in their traditional coalition, which is voters of color and young voters, and that is a systemic problem with Democrats, not just about 2024, which had all those specific challenges that you mentioned, David, but that Democrats have been losing these groups over the last 3 elections.
Yeah. I mean, what about the kind of simple explanation for, I guess, more focused on this election, which is that when you asked voters, what do you care about the most? And they said things like the economy and immigration. And then you said, who do you trust the most? They said Republicans. And in that sense, like, it doesn't seem very surprising if the things that are on people's minds, like inflation and a sense that the economy is not, that the American dream isn't working for people the way they wanted, they're going to be receptive to the party that they trust more on that issue. And I really think there's like a COVID hangover lurking in all of this, right? I mean, Democrats' trust and approval scores on education have plummeted, and that has to largely stem from COVID. And so I'm kind of sympathetic to just this explanation on its own, but maybe it also ties into the problem of institutions and becoming the party of authority, especially because I think part of the COVID hangover is feeling like there was incredible paternalism from public health authorities who didn't level with people at various moments.
I mean, the argument essentially is there's nothing Democrats could have done, is bluntly put. And I would add to that, if you look historically at what happened to Carter, George Herbert Walker Bush, and then people who weren't running for re-election, but what happened to their parties, Truman, Johnson, and George W. Bush in 2008. Like, if you looked at history, you would expect Harris to have lost as well. So it's both what's happening around the world, and the anti-incumbent feeling around the world, Biden's incredible unpopularity, and the historical picture all would suggest that Democrats shouldn't overread what just happened to them. But there's Nate Cohn who says, wait a minute, the last 3 elections, you're losing all of these groups. You can't say that this is some, that there isn't some big problem that needs fixing.
And then the other thing about losing groups is, like, once you start to lose groups, it becomes socially acceptable within your group to vote for Republicans. Like, that's a different norm than we've had for, some of these different groups, like Latino voters or even like young Black men.
Right. I think, John, I thought that was so well put. And I think Democrats who try to write this off as this is a global phenomenon and a temporal phenomenon are going to regret it. They do have to seize the moment and realign. The most shocking statistic that I saw about the election related to New York City, where we are now. And it's that 100,000 more people voted for Trump in New York City in 2024 than voted for him in 2020, which is interesting. 100,000, he gained 100,000 voters, but 500,000 fewer people voted for Kamala Harris than voted for Biden. So the Democrats lost 500,000 people, 500,000 voters in New York City alone in that period. And that's just enormous. And of course, it didn't matter. I mean, Harris won New York State going away. But in the long term, it signifies something important about the way the party is not reaching groups of people it once reached or needs to reach.
Right. And then is this like 2004 where, the Democrats got the shellacking, George W. Bush got reelected despite the Iraq war, but then the Democrats came back in 2006. Like, in other words, is this something that they can rectify by kind of perhaps, relearning the lesson they learned then, which is like, okay, you seem to be out of touch with ordinary Americans. Your priorities are coming across in a way that does not seem to reflect where a lot of people are at. Can you get with the program and address that? And, we're having this interesting debate among the Democrats about who should be the next chair of the Democratic National Committee, which is very tied into this. Ben Wickler, who has been leading the Wisconsin Democratic Party, has been really successful at, I think, exactly this issue of priorities. They had the super gerrymandered legislature. They were out of power except for holding the governor's office. And then my understanding is that the Democratic Party in Wisconsin really got behind trying to change the shape of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, which then allowed for a court ruling, which is now opening up these legislative races to being competitive. So that's one vision forward. And then there are other people, Rahm Emanuel seems like he might be interested in leading the way. And he obviously is someone who has little patience for the niceties of courting all the special interest groups on the Democratic side and goes straight for the kind of electable jugular, sort of stomping over everyone as he goes there.
Or he courts the constituencies where he needs to. So in maybe some blue district that's suddenly up for grabs that requires a lot of liberals to turn out, he's happy to court them there. He just recognizes that the shape of the party has to have many different kinds, and that and also just building on your theory about 2006, you obviously have some dynamics that are different between off year and presidential years. So when you think of the to-do list for Democrats trying to figure this out, they have to figure out what the message was. Do they overread the election or do they read it narrowly? Then they have to figure out how to run differently in an off year versus a presidential year. That has its own dynamics. And then the question is, how do you get your message across? Part of the critique from many Democrats is that the mainstream media failed at its job. And there is plenty to criticize the mainstream media about. However, as I mentioned from that previous poll finding that Ron Brownstein pointed out, voters know all about Donald Trump. And they have negative views about what they know about him, and yet they don't prioritize that in the list. And the question for Democrats is, do they need to harangue the press to be better, or do they need to harangue the voters? And that's never good when you're trying to get elected. So in other words, does a new theory of the case have to be created that communicates to voters in the way that they think? And that may be different than the expectations of Democratic strategists have been.
I mean, two notes on that. One is, I think it is saying that the mainstream media is at fault for what's happened is so off base. I don't think, however, it's wrong to look at the media. I think what has changed is that there's an incredibly powerful right-wing media ecosystem that is much better at motivating voters than any left-wing media ecosystem. And it exists across platforms. It exists in digital media. It exists in podcasting. It exists in TV. It exists in forums that the New York Times doesn't necessarily thrive in. So that's one point. And another point I would make is just, I worry, if I were a Democrat, I would worry about the following scenario, which is that we can pretty much guarantee there's going to be an insane amount of corruption in the next 4 years. There's going to be huge amounts of both federal incompetence and federal overreach, an intrusion into people's lives, and a lot of ruination. And I suspect what the Trump administration does is going to be wildly unpopular. And Democrats probably, if they are reasonably capable, should be able to win in 2026, and they should be able to win in 2028 with just that. But that does not solve the problem that they're dealing with, which is to reset what they stand for and who they're reaching. I think there will be the what is that? The thermostatic reaction. It'll be the reaction to them, to what Trump is doing, that will help them. But that doesn't reorient the party.
I would just add one other thing to my point about the media. There's the role that the mainstream media plays in a general election or towards the general populace. But I think if you are a partisan Democrat, I think you do have a case to make that we need to develop our own clubhouse, to have our own internal conversations, and stop being distracted by or trying to live up to the standards that the mainstream media uses when it covers things. The Republicans abandoned that a long time ago and have been, as you say, David, successful not just in sending a message outward, but also in keeping the internal conversation focused on a more narrow set of issues that a party and partisans need to figure out. So for Democrats, you can imagine success with the argument, let's stop being distracted by, what columnists think and be distracted by the real important issues of our party. And that seems to be a critique. It's not a journalistic critique. It's a political elites critique, but I think that also is a part of the argument about the press, which seems more valid.
So do you mean like Democrats should just start not overreacting to columnists, or do you mean they need to create their own propaganda machine? And then are you talking about like MSNBC on steroids, or some Democratic version of Barry Weiss's The Free Press? Like, what are we talking about?
I don't know. I guess what I was saying is that I think there are two categories of press criticism, one which seems more valid than the other. The one is kind of what role does it play in sending information to the voters, and does that inform voters sufficiently that they will make good decisions about picking their president? And I don't think voters were uninformed about Donald Trump's challenges. And so I don't think that is something that if they'd been any more informed, I mean, they couldn't be any more informed based on what the exit polls tell us. So I don't think that's a place where Democrats have a very strong case in terms of why they lost this last time around. Separately is this other question of how do Democrats talk to themselves just within their clubhouse. And so now I'm speaking in voice of that clubhouse, which I'm not in, but it makes more sense to me for Democrats to say, hey, we have internal fights that we have to wage. And those are based on what we think is best for the party. Stop having our debates based on the standards set by the mainstream media. The Republican Party doesn't do that. So why are we doing that? Because the standards they're setting are not in our party's interest, and therefore abandon those standards. Now, the downside, of course, of that is you then become even more insular than you are. And then you become, you basically just elect people to the clubhouse and can't appeal to voters outside the clubhouse.
Can we just close on the Ezra Klein argument, which I found really interesting? So Ezra says that Democrats have become the institutional party, and they have aligned themselves with institutions, and they've become conservative, essentially. That's in small c conservative. But that the institutions they've aligned themselves, the public feels to be fundamentally broken. And that is a problem, that they've aligned themselves with governments that don't build things, with public schools that are disappointing people, with sort of housing policies that don't build housing. I can't call to mind other ones. I'm sure he has other examples. What do you think that's right, Emily? Do you think there's truth to that?
I mean, I think that the idea that the government is sclerotic is familiar, right? And it goes back to like at least the 70s and 80s, where you have actually Jimmy Carter coming into office with the Paperwork Reduction Act, trying to make government function better. Government does end up with a lot of rules and regulations that don't make sense in some global way, even though each one of them was passionately fought for at the time. So I'm sympathetic to that argument. And I also, as I said earlier, I think the kind of paternalism of government, like the idea that they're these expert elites and they're going to tell everybody what to do, is super unappealing. And that there are some serious liberal blind spots related to COVID, for example, and shutting down schools that are examples of that. And so then I think it can be just really irritating, all of that. And it depends what level of government you're talking about, right? So some of the problems with housing and agencies, Amtrak, transportation, those really are federal level problems, but some of them are state and local, and it's difficult to untangle all of those things. I do think government going forward, that whenever government seems like it's not functioning, that tends to benefit Republicans. And so it'll be interesting to see whether the Democrats are willing to part with some of their kind of favorite regulations and red tape in order to seem like they can be the party of efficiency and streamlined getting things done for people.
Support for the Gabfest comes from USA for UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. People facing war and violence are now facing winter far from home in temporary shelters with little to keep them warm. As humanitarian needs in Ukraine, Afghanistan, Syria, and beyond increase, Ensuring continued funding to help the most vulnerable is more urgent than ever. You can help. Donate today to help keep families safe and warm this winter. UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, works around the clock to support the most vulnerable throughout the year, providing blankets, cash to buy warm clothes, fuel for heaters, and shelter. It's during the winter months that your support makes all the difference. Help protect refugees and people forced to flee as they faced winter far from home. Your gift is matched for a limited time. Give now at unrefugees.org/winter. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by SimpliSafe. If you ever worry about the safety of your home and family, there is no better time to act, because right now, SimpliSafe is extending its massive Black Friday deal for Gabfest listeners. You can get 50% off a new SimpliSafe security system by visiting simplisafe.com/Gabfest. This is your last chance to protect your home with SimpliSafe's lowest prices of the year. Trust SimpliSafe to protect your home and provide security and customer care. SimpliSafe has got a new way to protect your home. Traditional systems only take action once someone's inside your home. But SimpliSafe's active guard outdoor protection agents can see potential intruders in real time, talk to them directly, set off spotlights, and call the police before anyone breaks in. Plus, there are no long-term contracts, no cancellation fees, and it's only around $1 a day. Right now, SimpliSafe is offering Gabfest listeners 50% off any new system with a selected professional monitoring plan. This is their best offer of the year, but you have to act now. Head to simplisafe.com/Gabfest. That's simplisafe.com/Gabfest. There's no safe like SimpliSafe.
This episode is brought to you by Saks.com. There is joy in finding the perfect gift for the ones you love, but it can be a challenge. Saks.com's Holiday Gift Guide makes it easy. Whether you're surprising your hard-to-shop for sister with a Chloe bracelet, or gifting your partner a memorable scent from Gucci, at Saks.com, there's holiday inspiration for every personality on your list. So I went on Saks.com last night with my husband and my older son, and we were poking around for gifts for them. And we found a nice Michael Kors sweater that my kid liked, something from Ralph Lauren, and lots of themed socks, including socks with bicycles on them that looked really fun. Saks.com's hand-picked guide can help take the stress out of the holidays. Find gifts guaranteed to bring joy to everyone this holiday season at Saks.com. That's Saks.com for the ultimate holiday gift guide and all the shopping inspiration you need.
The Supreme Court heard arguments yesterday in a case about SB 1, the Tennessee law banning healthcare, gender-affirming healthcare for trans minors. What is that case about, Emily? What were the basic arguments from the two sides?
Yeah, so let me just start by talking a little bit about the human side of this issue of gender affirming care for kids, which actually didn't come up very much in court during the arguments yesterday. But, we all know kids who are benefiting from this care, and the categorical bans on it, which are only in the United States, are really painful for a lot of families and stigmatizing in themselves. And they're, pushing families out of some of the states where this is happening, almost entirely Republican controlled. We're talking about more than 20 states. So there's just underlying suffering going on here. The legal issues, however, are taking place on a kind of different plane. So normally states have a lot of leeway to pass health-related regulations, which is what Tennessee says these rules are. However, there are limits on that. And this case is framed in terms of the argument that Tennessee's ban violates the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause because it's a form of sex discrimination. The idea is that the state is drawing lines that are preventing people from getting puberty blockers or hormone treatments only if they want those drugs for purposes of transitioning, because these drugs are still available for other medical purposes. So, for example, doctors prescribe puberty blockers to stop precocious puberty, which is when kids start having puberty when they're really little. So the argument from the ACLU and the Biden administration in court is that the state said that they wanted kids to have more time to appreciate the sex of their birth and not to disdain it. And that's why they're banning these medications specifically for medical transition. And so the government and the ACLU lambda legal argument is that that's a form of sex-based line drawing, of sex-based classifications that is sex discrimination and also is discrimination against transgender people, which seems like pretty logical. Now, if you agree with that step...
Can I interrupt?
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
It's discrimination against transgender people, 100%. That it's sex discrimination seems like, I don't know. That seems like a rubber bandy kind of argument to me. I'm perplexed by it.
Yeah. Okay. So let's unpack that. So the problem with only arguing that it's discrimination against transgender people is that the Supreme Court has a short list of what are called suspect classifications, groups of people who get super special consideration. It's called strict scrutiny under the Constitution. And that list of groups is basically race, ethnicity, national origin. What people who share what's the courts call an immutable characteristic, something they can't change about themselves. Now, do LGBTQ people count as people with an immutable characteristic? The ACLU tried to make that argument, yes, in court yesterday, and you can certainly see the logic behind it. The Supreme Court has never said that LGBTQ people are a suspect class, and they kind of ducked this question in Obergefell, which is the marriage equality ruling. The chances that this conservative majority is going to expand the Constitution's protections in this case seem negligible.
Wait. But LGBTQ in that context is a meaning. I mean, that's like overly broad. Lesbian and gay is one thing, and T is a totally different thing. And why are they conflating those things?
Well, I was just trying to explain, you're right. I mean, we're talking about both sexual orientation and gender identity, and those are two different things. So sure, in theory, you could have this recognition for transgender people and not for people who are gay or lesbian. It's just often the court in the past has kind of lumped these classifications together. And honestly, the legal point that matters is just that it is so hard to imagine this majority extending constitutional protections for transgender people based on their transgender status. The lawyers tried yesterday. So anyway, that's why this more, I think, convoluted argument about sex-based discrimination looms very large. If the court were to agree with that part of the argument, then what you get is what's called heightened scrutiny. So basically, instead of the Tennessee government being able to say, we just are worried about this, any rational reason is enough to uphold the law, they have to have a really good reason. And if the Supreme Court bought into that idea, they would then send this case back to the district court judge to evaluate the evidence, the medical evidence, under this higher standard. It seemed very unlikely at argument yesterday that was going to happen, but not for very good reasons. I mean, this was where, to me, the logic of the conservative justices seemed to really kind of fall apart, because what they were basically saying was okay, we see medical uncertainty here, and therefore we're not going to apply heightened scrutiny, instead of the other way around, which is well, maybe we should take a really good look at this legislation, given that Tennessee talked about, preventing disdain from your sex of birth. Why should the state be getting in the way of parents making decisions about their kids?
What is that argument, either legally and or politically, since obviously we see all these other instances in which Republicans, I don't know what category to call people anymore, Republicans have been so angry about instances in which the state gets in the way in the relationship between parents and their kids.
This is the really curious thing about this case. When it was litigated, there were two arguments. There was the sex-based one I just went on at too much length. And there was also a challenge based on parental rights. There is also precedent, Supreme Court precedent, about parents having rights under the Constitution. And John, you're totally right. I mean, this is both, it seems like, the most obvious problem with letting the state categorically ban a treatment for kids, and also something conservatives care about. That question is not before the Supreme Court in this case. And what happened was that when there were two petitions for cert, which means just petitions for the court to hear the case, the Biden administration's petition only asked the court to talk about equal protection. The ACLU Lambda legal petition on behalf of the families, the plaintiffs, asked for both. The court only granted the Biden administration's petition, and so the parental rights question dropped out of the case, which was part of why it was such an unsatisfying argument, because you're looking at this issue in which I think the parental rights question should be in the forefront, and it's like it doesn't exist. I mean, Justice Kavanaugh kind of brought it up anyway, but that's not the grounds they're going to decide the case on. I should add that two things about this, which is one, it's possible that the Trump administration is going to come into office, change its position, and then this case is going to have to like get reheard, start over again. They're going to substitute in the ACLU and Lambda Legal as the main party, and then maybe they'll resurrect the parental rights question. Although for the sake of the conservative outcome that it seems like there was a majority for, that's not an advantage, right? They're better off just deciding this on equal protection grounds, which then could leave open a lower court judge to say, well, I'm still striking down one of these bans based on parental rights, and kind of dare the Supreme Court to then directly address that question. The second question I have is just that this case, it seemed so clear and predictable yesterday that the conservative majority was going to want to uphold these bans, right? For a lot of reasons. And I just really question what this case is doing here. Like, why did the Biden administration appeal it? Why did the plaintiffs appeal it? The reason is that when you have states, more than 20 states with bans, is people are really worried about the effects of those bans. Plus, you're representing actual clients who, I guess, must have wanted to try to test this before the Supreme Court. But, you know, there is like this very recent warning with another liberal cause, abortion rights, where there was Roe versus Wade. It protected abortion nationally. States started trying to test it by passing 20-week bans, which clearly violated Roe. The pro-choice lawyers let those bans stand because they were like, we're going to lose and we're going to see Roe eroded. Then the state of Mississippi passed a 15-week ban, and the pro-choice lawyers were like, okay, well, that goes too far. We can't let that stand. And then we ended up with Dobbs, which, of course, overturned Roe entirely. It just seems like the writing is on the wall here, and I don't understand the litigation strategy.
The cases are coming. We got to fight them. I mean, in other words, Dobbs came even without pro-choice lawyers.
No, it didn't. The pro-choice lawyers challenged Dobbs. Like, but challenged the Mississippi ban.
So your point is, let it live in Mississippi, as bad as that may be, because when you take it on, you're going to knock it out of 49 other states.
Yeah, you make this national precedent. And I am worried about what the Supreme Court majority opinion in this case is going to do for other kinds of transgender rights and for sex discrimination law writ large. And it just seems like maybe you don't throw a big softball down the middle of the plate for the conservative majority. Like, maybe that's not such a good idea.
You literally don't make a federal case about it.
Right. And obviously, I just want to make clear, like, the downside of that is then these state bans stand. But it seems like it was pretty obvious that was going to happen anyway. I should say one more thing, though. It's that one of the reasons the lawyers brought this case is there is a precedent on the book. It's called Bostock. From a few years ago, it's a Justice Gorsuch opinion that Chief Justice Roberts signed. So it had two conservative justices, and it found that there was protection against employment discrimination for transgender adults. So that seems pretty good as precedent here. And this whole theory that when you discriminate against trans people, it's a form of sex-based discrimination comes from Bostock. However, Bostock is about a statute. It's about Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. It's not about the Constitution. And so, again, it does not seem surprising that these very conservative justices are not going to be eager to take the rule from an employment discrimination case with a statute in which sex discrimination is in the text of the statute, right? They like text, and apply it to the Constitution in this context of kids.
One question about the kidness of it, Emily. Is it the case that now, once you reach 18, you can do whatever you want, and there are no efforts by states to prevent gender affirming care for people who are 18 in one day?
Yeah, that is the case. One of the other sort of like fearful slippery slopes possibilities from this case is a state banning adult care. And then if all the state has to do is justify that for any rational reason, will the courts say that that's okay? I don't want to get too worried about this idea right now because that just seems adults have transitioned in the United States of America and the world for many decades. There is lots of research supporting positive outcomes for them. It's not like states are moving in this direction. I think what we're far more likely to see under the Trump administration is an effort, unfortunately, to withdraw Medicaid funding from this kind of care, right? I mean, back to the abortion analogy, long before Dobbs, there was the Hyde Amendment, which prevents federal funds from being used for abortion. That's the conservative move for something that doesn't seem to have necessarily broad popular support. But this kind of question of opening the door to banning adult care is it is a slippery slope problem.
But isn't it also the case, and you've written so much about this, and we are definitely not going to get to the answer here, but the evidence about gender affirming care for kids is ambiguous. It's not clear what is the right approach and who should get it and what they should get.
Right. And then the question is, who gets to decide in that context, right? I mean, the normal conservative answer would be parents decide. You don't have the state come in and impose an outright ban on something that, yes, the evidence is mixed overall. The lack of long-term evidence has meant that in some European countries, they have set limits, but no European country is categorically banning this care because clearly some kids benefit from it. And, the idea that should be up to parents, that medical organizations should improve their standards, that, okay, maybe in some circumstances, kids aren't getting adequate psychological assessments, but that's something that the medical profession should be pressured to address, that not a state legislature stepping in. That's the part of this that I think is really problematic.
How much was it discussed in argument, or is this even a part of the damage that is done to trans kids who don't get this care? That, the Tennessee's worried about damage of one kind, but there's obviously another kind. Was that a part of the discussion?
That definitely came in. The idea that, for some kids, there is concern about depression and anxiety and even risk of suicide. Though I should say on that last part, the evidence is contested trans kids are absolutely more at risk of lots of mental health harms. Bullying to start with, but also all of the things we just talked about. The question is whether the treatment actually reduces them in the long term. But setting that aside for a moment, it just seems clinically, from people's observations, from all of the testimony that we hear from kids, there are definitely risks to being shut out of a kind of care that you need. And yes, that did come up in court. I think what we heard from justices like Kavanaugh in particular in response to that was we're seeing there are risks on all sides. How are we, the court, supposed to decide that? No, of course, the answer to that normally would be the parents. Yeah, exactly.
Let's go to cocktail chatter. We had some cocktails last night. I don't know whether your chatter that you're about to do, John, was something you literally chattered about when we had cocktails together last night or not. What is your chatter?
It was not. I was trying to decide whether there was anything in what I said last night that was actually chatter worthy, but it wasn't. So I'll do this. So a fellow named Duncan McCabe spent 10 months and about 700 miles running in a very specific pattern to make this animation, 27-second long video animation that is the result of his GPS tracking software, which I think is called Strava. Anyway, we'll put the Washington Post story that this came from in our show notes, but essentially using its map function, he ran 120 different runs, and each time he ran a different route so that when you strung them all together, it creates a hat-wearing stick figure who's dancing to a song. And so he carried it off, and everyone needs a hobby.
My chatter this week is about a different Supreme Court case that really got completely swamped by lots of other news. It's called Simons versus Hungary, and it's a group of Holocaust survivors and their families led by Rosalie Simons, who are in her 90s, who were dispossessed of all of their property in the Holocaust. So the Hungarian government basically confiscated everything. It is obviously many years later, but these plaintiffs want compensation from their property, and they are suing in American courts. Normally, you can't sue another sovereign country in an American court, but there's an exception. There's this law called the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, which, if the property has been taken in violation of international law, may or may not be able to kick in this case and allow the plaintiffs to go forward. It's just a really interesting set of questions. What happened was the Hungarian government took the money and commingled it with lots of other Hungarian funds. And so the plaintiff's theory is like, look, the government did that years ago. It's all commingled. They did business with it in the United States, and that's enough for us to sue them. And the DC Circuit, the Court of Appeals, agreed with them. The argument on the other side from Hungary is basically like, are you kidding? Every sovereign country can get sued for everything if this case is allowed to go forward. That is not supposed to be what the United States court system is for. So anyway, we'll see what happens when we eventually get a decision in that less high profile case.
I never thought I'd hear myself being sympathetic to the government of Viktor Orban, but it seems kind of right.
I mean, it's a tricky one because it's not like they have other recourse. And this thing about commingling is real. Like, should a foreign government be able to take all your property and just put it into the normal? No. But then the question is the remedy a suit in U.S. court? My
chatter is about a fascinating, grim story in The Atlantic by one of my favorite reporters, William Langewiesche.
Wait, that is not in The Atlantic. That is in my New York Times.
Oh, it's in the New York Times Magazine. It's in the New York Times Magazine. Emily's so right. You're absolutely right. It's in the New York Times Magazine. And so there are only two publications, the New York Times and The Atlantic, left in America. So I knew it was one or the other. Yes, in the New York Times Magazine. The secret Pentagon war game that offers a stark warning for our times. Langewiesche, who's just an amazing reporter of systems and processes and also of war and military, digs into this nuclear war game that was carried out in 1983 in the Reagan Pentagon under the aegis of Cap Weinberger, the defense secretary, and run by a future Nobel Prize winning game theorist who designed it, about what would happen in the case of a low-level nuclear conflict. Could a nuclear conflict be contained? And it's an amazing story about this game. And in this war game where the US and the Soviets, so that I'm using those in quotes, it's the red team and the blue team, had a small exchange of very tiny battlefield nukes, and it escalates almost instantly, inexorably to total nuclear apocalypse. And the game ended up kind of changing US nuclear policy. It changed how Weinberger and how the Reagan administration thought about nuclear war. And there had been a belief that there was a winnable nuclear war, a limited nuclear war, and that seemed to have leached out of the Reagan administration and led to a lot of the non-proliferation and weapons reductions. And what's interesting about this article is that Langewiesche is saying basically that all that knowledge and all that kind of history about the consequences of nuclear war have been lost because people are focusing on things like cyber terrorism and climate and other forms of disaster that can befall us, and not on nukes. But that nukes do have this unique ability to really wipe out human civilization. And we had better remember this as China rearms, as more and more countries develop nuclear power, India, Pakistan. And it's just a really, really good article. I don't know if did you read it?
I read it. I found it haunting. Yeah.
I mean, because we grew up in that generation. I'm sure that you guys were like this. Like, one out of every two nights of sleep ended with a nuclear annihilation dream for me. And, we thought a lot about it. I don't think our kids...
1 out of every 2.
I'm just talking.
Oh, okay.
I'm just talking.
No, but I thought, I mean, what was that movie? The one...
The Day After.
The Day After, yes. That was a part of all of our childhoods.
Anyway, we thought about it a lot, and I don't think our kids think about it. Listeners, you have sent chatters to us. Please email them to us at gabfest@slate.com. There's so many good ones that keep coming in. And our listener chatter this week comes from a repeat chatterer, Bob Rosner.
Hello, this is Bob Rosner from San Francisco. My chatter this week is about the terrific Hulu series Say Nothing, based on the book by Patrick Radden Keefe. I have long been interested in the parallels between the Troubles and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Both are based on two communities with strong historical and cultural claims to the same land, beset by a decades-long cycle of violence and retaliation. Say Nothing focuses on the Belfast chapter of the IRA and follows 4 characters, Dolores and Marion Price, Brendan Hughes, and Jerry Adams, who went from armed struggle in the IRA, regularly denied, to the leader of Sinn Féin, where he was an important figure in negotiating the Good Friday Agreement, where both parties realized that neither side was going away and that peaceful coexistence was the only way forward. As it turns out, we only make peace with our enemies.
That's all for our episode this week, but we also have a bonus episode in your feed. We're going to talk about some conundrums that we didn't get to at our Conundrum show last night in Brooklyn. But that's only for Slate Plus members, the Slate Plus segment. You get so much good stuff for your subscription. You get bonus episodes, discounts to live shows, no hitting the paywall on the Slate site. And if you are a member, please enjoy that episode, that special episode. If you're not a member, you can subscribe to Slate Plus directly from the Political Gabfest show page on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or visit slate.com/Gabfest Plus to get access wherever you listen. That is our show for today. The Gabfest is produced by Cheyna Roth. Our researcher is Julie Huygen. Our theme music is by They Might Be Giants. Ben Richmond is Senior Director for Podcast Operations. Alicia Montgomery is the VP of Audio for Slate. Emily Bazelon and John Dickerson. I'm David Plotz. There's a siren outside. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week.
This episode is brought to you by Saks.com. There is joy in finding the perfect gift for the ones you love, but it can be a challenge. Saks.com's holiday gift guide makes it easy. Whether you're surprising your hard-to-shop-for sister with a Chloe bracelet or gifting your partner a memorable scent from Gucci, at Saks.com, there's holiday inspiration for every personality on your list. So I went on Saks.com last night with my husband and my older son, and we were poking around for gifts for them. And we found a nice Michael Kors sweater that my kid liked, something from Ralph Lauren, and lots of themed socks, including socks with bicycles on them that looked really fun. Saks.com's hand-picked guide can help take the stress out of the holidays. Find gifts guaranteed to bring joy to everyone this holiday season at Saks.com. That's Saks.com for the ultimate holiday gift guide and all the shopping inspiration you need.